Hi, welcome back. I'm Kevin and this is Media Union. So in today's little experiment, I've been talking about SBIR for the last video, and so I wanted to just check myself by running a couple of experiments. So first things first, let's jump into REW and we'll talk about what I've done and how I'm trying to assess the need for any change within my room. Okay, let's do that. So right now in REW, I'm showing you that I created a baseline this morning. Set my, my listening position is about here. I put my microphone in a listening position from A through H, and I found that the G was the best position. This is based upon like 3 or 4 inches difference between, adding 3 or 4 inches difference in the distance between my speakers and my listening position. So I found a position that I like the most called G. So I put my ECM 8000 in that position, ran a sweep with REW, and what you're seeing on the screen is exactly what the result was, what I received this morning from the room. So I was pondering this and said, well, using the EQ tools within REW, I said, oh my gosh, I think I might need to play with this. And by play with this, I mean there are tools out there that many of you have pointed me towards, because I came from a background of, oh hell no, you never put an EQ in your final mixing monitors. You don't do that. And maybe that's part of the juju or the misdirection or the misinformation that I received in my early years as a recording engineer. But I know that people EQ their rooms. SoundWorks does that, Diac does that, Mini DSP does that. Anyone who's an audiophile, and I'm not calling myself an audiophile, because I didn't understand that a lot of you folks out there who are audiophiles were actually inserting hardware between your amplifier and your speakers to make your room sound better. Now, I knew that some studios might EQ their 2-bus, but it was really kind of, in my educational process 30 years ago, really poo-pooed to put an EQ on your 2-bus in your room. But there's reason for that. And now I know that that's not true. So, as I've done here, as I took the EQ functionalities within REW, which allows you to put a piece of hardware, a DSP piece, meaning you're going to do some sort of digital sound processing between your Macintosh or your amplifier in your audiophile listening space and your speakers, and you're going to futz with the room's response. So using that tool that's built into REW, I basically took some measurements and I had it suggest for me some changes I could do with my target response that I'd want for my room, especially between, let's just say between 40 hertz and 160, which is my Schrader cutoff. So that's what I did, is I basically ran a target curve and came back with some changes that I need to make around 40, around 80, and I futzed around a little bit later on as I show you. I futzed around in this area between, a good 130 and 1K. So what I want you to take from that long monologue is I'm going to futz with a 2-bus EQ application. So the 32SC has a 4-band EQ that I can have on a return from my Mac. So my Mac comes back from my DAW, or my Mac plays back into my 32SC, and then I'm going to put an EQ on that and futz with these frequencies, and then I'm going to pump that futzing, if you want to call it that, that's coming out of my speakers. I'm going to record that through REW and go, I wonder what it's done. So let's actually do that. I'll show you what I did. So closing the REW EQ window, I'm showing you the baseline of the day. So what I did is I came in and I set 2 EQs, one at 48 hertz, one at 79 hertz. The gain was -4 for the 48 and -9 for the 79. The Qs are important, but not super important. One is 2.6, one is 4.9. The thing to remember is that as you go up in Q, the more narrow the band of frequencies you're futzing with. Okay? So I set those and I ran it, and this is my response. So as you can see here, the change at 48 hertz and the change at 79 hertz had some major impact in my low end, my subwoofer specifically. So I looked at that and said, hey, I think this dip or this cut I've just made at the 79 hertz level is too much. So what I did is I came back and I futzed with the EQ on my 32SC, which you're seeing now. I futzed with that and changed the EQ, specifically the 79 hertz from -9 dB. I dropped it down to -6 dB, and this was the result. So I've definitely created more of a plateau. Granted, there's some phasing that's going on there, but there is a plateau that has been impacted there. So my low frequencies, or my sub bass into my bass regions, has flattened out, and I'm like, yeah, that sounds great. Sounds good to me, but I thought, well, wait a second. I've got this interesting bump that has now popped up at 135. So I dropped another EQ, showing you it on the screen right now. I took another EQ at 135, -4 dB, and the Q of 3, and I dropped it in at 135, obviously. And that was the impact. So you can see that it didn't necessarily impact the two other EQs that I dropped in, but it definitely impacted exactly where I wanted to futz with it. The rest of the EQ is pretty much following what I expect. The response of the room hasn't changed in, anywhere above 200 hertz. So everything is happening as expected. So the next thing I thought I would do is I don't really like these bumps here. So I thought, okay, well, let's just play with this concept a little bit more and adjust my room by adding a fourth EQ. It's going to be a really wide bell curve, or a peak form of an EQ, and it's at 448 -4, but the Q is really wide. I mean, the Q, as you can see from the screen on the 32SC, it's a really broad Q. And here's the response after running the sweep. So it definitely impacted it. And if I compare it to the previous one, pull the baseline off, it definitely made a change. Maybe the Q is too wide because it definitely impacted even 135. So the takeaway from that is, as you're placing EQs on your frequencies, and the width of your Q can really futz with things that you liked before. So if I really liked my 135 where it was, that broad Q of 0.5 is too broad, because I'm messing with things that I had already fixed, or I thought I had fixed. So we want to be careful with our Q settings on those EQs that we're applying to fix certain frequencies and or bands of frequencies. So with that in mind, I feel I have got a really, really good response, or I think the results of this little experiment have shown me that some things can be different if you just apply some crazy thought to it. So many of you might think this is just crazy. You already know all this stuff. But for some of us, we were told that certain things weren't cool to do. I am very, very glad that I just wanted to challenge that concept. After downloading SoundWorks and seeing how it worked going through its demo, I recognized all it was doing was placing a bunch of EQs on my 2-bus. And I have more than enough EQs in this room that I don't really need to go and buy more technology that I have to manage. So, major takeaway: yes, you can futz with your room by putting an EQ on your 2-bus. Other big takeaway is REW has some really cool ways to show you how you may adjust that EQ that's needed on your 2-bus for your room. Third big takeaway is you can buy technology, but before you buy technology to EQ your 2-bus to make your room sound better, go find some tools that you've already purchased that are within your tools, like your board, or potentially a parametric EQ that's maybe a 4-band parametric EQ that you're using as an outboard piece of gear that you haven't used for years because it's sitting in a rack because you're in the box. Everything's being done in the box. Go find that sucker and apply it to your room. Insert it between your output on your control room output or your master output that's dumping into your speakers in your room, and lo and behold, you'll have a 4-band parametric EQ that you can futz with the sound of your room. Granted, it's not going to get to 20 different EQs, and I'll show you that here, what I mean by those 20 different EQs, but you'll have 4. Like I've used the 4 in just my DAW coming back into my 32SC. Those 4 EQ bands have really made a big difference in my room, and I didn't spend a penny. Just spend a little bit of time figuring stuff out. So with that in mind, I'm going to talk about the EQ functionality within REW. So let's be clear about this. REW doesn't do the EQ in your room. REW just provides settings for any hardware you've put into your system. In my case, I needed 4 different EQ bands to futz with what I could futz with. I'm using futz a lot. That's bad. So I used 4 different EQs that were readily available on the channel strip where my max DAW, I use Studio One, but where my max DAW comes back into the 32SC, I just messed with those 4 bands of EQ because I'm using REW's EQ functionality to do that. So let me show you how that works. So I'm going to go to EQ, and the most important thing is that you always select before you go into EQ. This is a gotcha. As you go into, you select your last sweep that you want to futz with. I'm going to use it again. Then what you do is you say target settings. Obviously I am off the screen here. Let me bring this a little bit more on. So I'm going to talk about my subwoofer settings. And if you just leave the bass management slope at 12 dB and the low frequency slope at 24, you set your low end of your frequencies that you want to deal with, and then you set your highs. I'm going to set this at 120. Okay, so now I've got that. I'm going to say, okay, now I've got that. I'm going to say, calculate the target level from that sweep, the last sweep I did, calculate it and tell me what I need to do. So it says, okay, well, that's what your curve is going to look like. So I'm going to change this down to up to 200. So it's saying this is your target. This is what you think you need to do. This is what we think you're going to need to do. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to create a measurement for my target shape. And so this is what in my screen of my sweeps, this is what REW thinks I need to do to my subwoofer, basically. It's saying, oh, well, you need to do these changes. So I'm going to go back to my original. I'm going to go back to the EQ, and then I'm going to go to filter tasks. And so I'm going to say, I'm going to match the range of that filter, or that target that I think I need to do. I'm going to match that. So between 20 and I'm going to say 200 with an individual maximum boosting that would happen. So let's just say moving that EQ gain can go no higher than 9 dB. The overall max boost is 0. I want to keep things pretty flat. I don't really necessarily want to boost things up to 9. But the flatness target is if it decides it does need to move something up, it will say I'm going to only do it within a 3 dB range. So that's what those do. And I'm going to allow narrow filters because I want to see in between 10 or 20 and 200. I want to see specific cues that I need to apply in that small range, with that 180 hertz range. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to click here. I'm going to say match response to target. It's going to go through this process and it's going to say, oh, wait, so for you, Kev, you need to do some changes. I love the fact that it comes back and goes, oh, well, this is what it would look like in a waterfall. But the important part is it came back and it said, oh, you've got a mini DSP 2x4 HD is what you want to use. Oh, I'm going to say, okay, with that, it's going to give me 10. But REW's subwoofer analysis tool for the EQ said, oh no, we only need to use 8. And you can see those 8 there. So if I want to see what the actual specific recommendations are, and I'm not going to do this, but I'm just going to show you what REW is suggesting for that EQ curve, that response curve, what the EQ would be for that response curve. This is what it is. The mini DSP 2x4 HD comes with 10 EQs. So what you would do is, if you have mini DSPs, you take this information and you can create a file and load it into your mini DSP on your subwoofer source. And it will put these parametric EQs, as you see here, it's only using 8 of the 10 for that source in mini DSP 2x4 HD. It's saying, oh, for your first one, you need to put your frequency at 42, the gain needs to be minus 4.8, and the EQ needs to be really narrow. It needs to be 7 point something. I don't think my 32SC can get that narrow, but I guess I could try. So this is where you get your information, which is kind of fun. It's kind of cool. It does its thing, shows you that. I'm not going to load this file because this REW will allow you to generate a filter file. It says save filter coefficients to file. REW will pump this out into a text flat file. I think it's comma separated. And you can load it into your mini DSP. That's great. For guys like me who don't have mini DSP on in my system right now, I'm going to just take these. I'm going to go over to my screen of my 32SC, and I'm just going to set my bands manually. So that was a lot of information. Let me just make sure I hit the high points. Taking the last sweep I made of the room, I can go over to the EQ section of REW, identify a target that I want to EQ to, have REW generate suggested EQ settings for that target. Then I can take them out of my system and punch them into my device, my parametric EQ, in my case my 32SC. I will go and punch in that information, and lo and behold, I can come back and run a sweep after all those changes get pumped into my 32SC's EQ. I can actually impact the next sweep. So that's kind of the nuts and bolts of this video. Is rather than being really wound up around SBIR and trying to figure out where my subwoofer sits in the room, many of you have been very helpful and said, why don't you align your sub? Why don't you EQ your sub? And I was like, because I wasn't supposed to. That's being shady or sneaky. And you guys have really, really taken me out of that purist concept of, oh no, you don't put anything in your EQ. You make sure your room is perfect. Thank you guys for breaking me out of that bad paradigm and getting into a paradigm of, hey, it's not juju, it's really for the benefit of your customer, it's really for the benefit of your ears, that your room helps you make decisions that sound great in here, but more importantly, sound great on Spotify, sound great in the car, sound great on their iPod if they're still using them. It really, really builds confidence in you about your room. But more importantly, it really builds confidence in your customer that what they heard in here and they go out in the car and play it on Spotify if they've loaded it, they go, wow, that's the same mix I heard in Kev's room. So with that said, I hope you've enjoyed this. I hope you've learned something. A lot of information, definitely fire hose. I apologize for that. If you have any questions or comments or suggestions, leave your thoughts in the comments below. Ask some questions. I'd be more than happy to walk through personally or answer some of those questions in the next video. I'm sure some of you are going to ask questions about mini DSP and how you can tweak your room without spending $400 or more on a bunch of software that you could do within the hardware you've already got. You just need to figure out how to do it. With that in mind, thanks for listening. Take care of yourself, and I'll see you in the next video.